Good afternoon, Professor Williamson. I'm very happy to see you. My name is Francois-Igor Igor Evgenievich Pris. I work at the Institute of Philosophy of the National Academy of Sciences of Belarus. Thank you for accepting my invitation to give an interview and to tell about your philosophy and your research work. You're the Wickham Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford and Fellow of New College, Oxford. You are one of the world's leading philosophers. You've made great contributions to philosophy, to many domains of philosophy, in particular to logic, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of language, and so on. You are the author of the excellent books, Identity and Discrimination, Vagueness, Knowledge and Its Limits, Philosophy of Philosophy, Model Logic as Metaphysics, Tetralogue, Doing Philosophy, From Common Curiosity to Logical Reasoning, the same book in the paperback, Philosophical Method, a very short introduction, the most recent books, Suppose and Tell, Debating the A Priori with Paul Bogosian, and you published more than 200 articles. The books Williamson and Knowledge and Williamson on Modality contain essays on your work with your replies. And I would recommend your books Tetralogue and Doing Philosophy, the same book in the paperback Philosophical Method, to a very large audience, to everybody who is interested in philosophy, and of course for the professionals also. So, Professor Williamson, please, as I know, your philosophical position is realism. Once you said, my instincts are realist about everything. And how do you understand realism, or what kind of realism do you endorse? What is your conception of reality?
So I don't think of realism as something terribly precise, but just a general approach. It's one that regards reality as something that is largely independent of us. I mean, we're just one little species on one small planet, and so it's possible for us to be ignorant and in error about any topic whatsoever. But it's also possible for us to attain some knowledge. I mean, we've gotten, as it were, we have no right to know everything about reality, but the cognitive powers that we have, which evolved for, as it were, relatively practical reasons, turn out to be ones that we can use in a much broader way. So, as I say, I think it's this conception of reality as something that is beyond our belief and knowledge, but not for that reason automatically unknowable.
Okay, so for instance, for Jocelyn Benoit, a French philosopher, reality, this is its definition, is just what it is. Do you agree with it?
I mean, reality, yeah, reality is just as where whatever is the case. So it's a completely as an open question what that is, just in calling it reality. Yeah.
Okay, and how do you distinguish between what is real and what is not real?
Well, I mean, that's something that we have to do, all the time, and we have to be able to tell the difference between a reflection and well, the reflection is real, but it's not real that there's something in the water maybe that it's just a reflection. So that as we're distinguishing how things seem from how things are is something that all kinds of animals have to be able to do, and then as it were the ways in which we we do that, we gradually become more systematic and critical, and so that as it were, we're applying them in science as well. But it's as it were, there's no single panacea, or I mean, to distinguish between appearance and reality. But as I say, it's not something that is very mysterious in principle, because that is just part of ordinary cognition, that things are not always what they seem.
Okay. And are you a metaphysical realist or a scientific realist? Would you say so?
Of course, those are not terribly precise terms, but I think I probably count as a metaphysical realist in a very broad sense. I mean, that I'm realist about really all aspects of reality. I mean, in the sense that I think there's, as it were, there is a true and a false answer to these questions, irrespective of whether it's one that can be found by natural science. I mean, of course, I mean, so I don't. As to whether I'm a scientific realist, I don't identify science with natural science in the sense of sort of physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. Because, for example, I regard mathematics as another science that's just as genuine as they are, and just as concerned with the nature of reality. But I certainly regard the natural sciences as one of the best sources of knowledge that we have. But I don't think one can reduce philosophy to some kind of natural science. I think, as I say, I think bearing in mind the example of mathematics is a good reminder that that there's more than one way of being scientific.
And is there any relation between your conception, between your realist position and your epistemology, your philosophy of mind, and so on?
Yes, I think there is, because I think the centrality that I give to knowledge there's a kind of realist conception there, because knowledge itself is something that we can be right or wrong about, because we can think we have knowledge when in fact we're suffering from some kind of illusion, and so it's important for me that that epistemology should take as well, should understand that its subject matter is not one that we have any extremely privileged access to, that it is all part of this reality that is to some extent independent of us, but still knowable. And that, you know, I think it's a mistake that some epistemologists make, to think that somehow epistemology starts with subjectivity or something like that. And I think if you think about how, you know, our cognitive powers evolved, because I mean, we're not the only species of animal that has lots of knowledge of its environment and so on. I think that's a much more realistic starting point than just starting with, as it were, a kind of bubble of consciousness or something like that.
Thank you very much. Professor Williamson, for you, classical logic is a true scientific theory. So it says something about the structure of reality, isn't it? Yeah. And what is the status of alternative logics?
So some alternative logics are, they simply, as it were, give up some aspects of classical logic. So they as where they don't add anything new, but they doubt some parts of classical logic. I mean, a typical aspect of classical logic to be doubted is the law of excluded middle, that everything, either is a given way or it's not that way. And so if that's what an alternative logic is doing, it's not making any mistakes, given that classical logic is correct, because it's simply a part of classical logic. But it's, I think, for unreasonable reasons, it's simply, as it were, self-imposing some logical ignorance. But very often with classical, with alternative logics, you find that that in some way they're actually denying something in classical logic. For example, they may be saying that not all cases satisfy the law of excluded middle or something like that. And then in those cases, I think that they're simply making an error that is like an error in mathematics, but maybe an error in mathematics that's not so easy to identify. But it's like doing some mathematics by some kind of non-standard rules that are incorrect, but where you can't immediately identify that they're incorrect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if for example, classical logic is a true scientific theory. In physics, for example, let us take the classical mechanics and the quantum mechanics. They have their own domains of application. And do different logics have their own domains of application, or that's not the case?
Well, so I guess in the case of mechanics, the classical mechanics is just as it were an approximation to quantum mechanics, and and in many areas it's close enough to quantum mechanics that it's fine to use it. So it's true that some proponents of non-classical logics have that picture. I mean, they think that that classical logic is okay in certain areas, but that it breaks down in other areas. In fact, at one time there was a fashion for quantum logic, which claimed that classical, Hilary Putnam and some others proposed this with the idea that the classical logic breaks down in the quantum domain, but maybe it's okay in the macroscopic domain. I think that idea has now been pretty generally rejected, because it turns out that the kinds of problem that in quantum mechanics that it was supposed to help you understand, it didn't really help with at all. I mean, they were just as hard to understand, even if you rejected these classical principles. And so that version isn't working. So I mean, so my view is that fundamentally the general principles of classical logic are completely universal, in the same way that there is no domain where 2 + 2 is a bit more or less than 4. But certainly that picture of different logics holding for different domains is one that some non-classical logicians like.
Thank you. Professor Williamson, you created, developed, and you defend an alternative theory of knowledge, knowledge-first epistemology. I think that it is a true theory about knowledge, so I'm in favor of this approach. Is it possible to resume it in a few sentences, say a list of axioms, laws, postulates, like a scientific theory sometimes, a list of axioms or not?
Yeah, I think that there won't be anything quite as neat as a list of axioms. I think what people need to understand is that it's a contrast between, roughly speaking, between two directions of explanation in epistemology. I mean, so the main, as it were, competitor for knowledge first epistemology is belief first epistemology, and with knowledge first epistemology, as it were, taking the idea of knowledge as the explanatorily basic and explaining other things in terms of that, and including explaining belief in terms of knowledge, whereas the alternative takes belief as explanatory basic and tries to explain knowledge in terms of belief. I mean, maybe for some people watching who are not so familiar with this, I should say something about the distinction between knowledge and belief. So, I mean, the most important single distinction is just that that you can have belief in something false, but you can't know something which is false. For example, that you can't, although people can believe that the Earth is flat, they can't know that the Earth is flat, but just because it isn't. I mean, of course, some people think that they know that the Earth is flat, but that's another mistake that they're making. So that's as it were, the single most salient difference between knowledge and belief. But another aspect to this is that even true belief can fall short of knowledge. So, for example, suppose suppose you have a guru and you believe everything your guru tells you, but in fact, this guru is he's just making stuff up. He's not, he has no genuine insight, and so your guru might be telling you things at random, and you because you have complete trust in him, you believe everything he tells you, and so so some of the things that he tells you happen to be true, and some happen to be false. But the ones that are true, you don't come to know anything just by believing them, because he's a completely unreliable source. So as well, knowledge has to be gained in a way that is somehow more connected to the truth than that. And so I regard this notion of knowledge as a better starting point. First it might seem that it doesn't make a big difference that if you're a belief first epistemologist, you try to add stuff to belief to get knowledge, and if you're a knowledge first epistemologist, you try to subtract stuff to get belief from knowledge. But there's actually a much deeper methodological contrast between them, because what knowledge first epistemology is doing is, as it was, it's starting from the good non-defective case of cognition and giving that priority and explaining belief that isn't knowledge. I mean, for example, false belief, explaining that in terms of how it deviates from the case of knowledge. So that's a bit like, if you're studying imagine a doctor studying the heart. They're going to as it were, want to know how the heart functions when everything is going well, and then they'll understand diseases of the heart as roughly speaking deviations from the good functioning, and so it's giving priority to the non-defective case over the defective case, whereas belief first epistemology is, as it were, is putting the defective and non-defective cases on a par. It's, as it were, treating them equally, and then as we're trying to explain the difference between them from that kind of neutral starting point. And I think, again, if one thinks about as well, the evolution of a cognitive system, then I mean the reason that we evolved to have beliefs is because we evolved to have knowledge, so that we can act successfully, to adapt our actions to changes in the environment and so on. And then the fact that we can have mistaken beliefs is a kind of byproduct of something that evolved to give us knowledge. So it seems to me in that way that it's a very natural order of explanation. And then, I mean, there are all sorts of things that one can explain very simply in those terms. So, for example, sense perception is a matter of acquiring knowledge. Memory is for retaining knowledge. Testimony, I mean, telling people things, is for communicating knowledge. And then in conversation, I've argued that the basic norm on what one can assert is that one should assert only what you actually know. And then in science, the idea is that our evidence is the totality of what we know, and that's what we use to evaluate theories. And something like learning, for example, I mean, many people who as it were, officially adopt a belief-first attitude, they still talk about learning, but learning means acquiring knowledge. And I mean, I think almost everyone agrees that learning is a good thing, but if it just meant acquiring beliefs, it would not necessarily be a good thing, because you can acquire false beliefs. But if you think of it as acquiring knowledge, then it's kind of clear why it's a good thing. So I think that, as well, lots of aspects of cognition are much more naturally understood in terms of knowledge than in terms of belief.
Very much. And so I think that the traditional epistemology is based on the false premises of modern philosophy, which your knowledge first epistemology rejects. Is it correct? I mean, the primacy of epistemology, metaphysics of interiority. Do you reject representationalism, for example, and so on? So the premises of modern philosophy.
Yes. So I do think of, for example, of Descartes as really starting in the wrong place, and I mean starting just as it were as it were within the bubble of his own consciousness, and then trying to argue his way out of that into contact with the external world. And I think actually probably most people would really think that approach isn't going to work. And I mean, in Descartes, he kind of cheats by giving a fallacious proof of the existence of God to solve the problem for him. I mean, I don't think that all philosophy in history, or even all philosophy or all epistemology since Descartes, it's not all been belief first epistemology. I mean, I think in some ways, I mean, Julien Douton and others have pointed out that, in fact, belief first epistemology it is a kind of 20th century phenomenon in some ways. I mean, because for
Oxford tradition.
Well, the knowledge, yes. I mean, knowledge first is an Oxford tradition, yeah. That
knowledge first, yeah, knowledge first.
Yes. Yes, and but it actually goes way back in the history of philosophy. I mean, so for example, it seems there was a lot of knowledge first epistemology in ancient India, and I mean, there was a time when people thought that Plato was a kind of belief first epistemologist, because it's true that he discusses some attempts to analyze knowledge in terms of belief. But I think it doesn't really seem plausible that Plato was a belief first epistemologist.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
He was considering these analyses, but he didn't accept them. And I think probably the predominant style of epistemology in ancient Greece was a knowledge first one as well. But yes, I think it's true that a lot of modern philosophy, in the sense in which we philosophers talk about modern philosophy, i.e. philosophy over the last sort of four centuries or a bit more. A lot of that took as a starting point something, some kind of subjective consciousness in a way which seems to me quite inappropriate. Yeah.
Okay, so traditional epistemology analyzes the concept of knowledge, and there are many different analyses of knowledge, many different definitions, attempts to solve the so-called get-here problem. And are these analyses useful?
I mean, I think they have produced a whole lot of interesting examples, which do show us, as it were, how complex the as it were, the geography of these epistemological distinctions are. But I don't think that, as it were, that they were kind of, good approximations to the truth or something like that, because they were taking the analysis in the wrong direction, and in fact, I think it's often the case that many of the notions that they were trying to explain knowledge in terms of actually themselves have to be understood in terms of knowledge. So in that sense, it was getting everything back to front. But I mean, surely we did gain some kind of understanding of this, and it's not unreasonable to spend some time, on a project which eventually doesn't work out, and but at least that way we have more understanding of why it didn't work out.
Of course, there is no non-secular analysis of knowledge in the form of necessary and sufficient conditions. But let us take, for example, the so-called anti-luck or anti-risk virtue epistemology of Duncan Pritchard. This is a combination of the cognitive virtue condition and the safety condition on true belief. And let us suppose that this analysis is secular, so knowledge first. Yeah. So is it compatible with your knowledge first epistemology?
Yeah. So one point which I think you may have in mind, which is important, is that perhaps surprisingly, it is possible for a definition to be both circular and yet informative. And I mean, a simple example of that is that, if we want to define the notion of something being common knowledge, we could say that something is common knowledge if and only if everyone knows that it's common knowledge. And I mean, that of course is an obviously circular definition, but it actually does tell you that if something is common knowledge, then everyone knows that everyone knows, and everyone knows, and so on. But having said that, I don't really find Pritchard's approach helpful. I mean, it's too much of an idea salad for me, and I don't think that that just, as it were, mixing different ideas with different motivations together produces a stable or illuminating theory. I think that one really needs a more unified approach than that. And you know, so for example, you know, if with a combination of something like safety and cognitive virtue, I think if you understand safety correctly, it will do all the work that the cognitive virtue was supposed to do. So,
and vice versa, no?
Yes, but I think it will turn out, and fundamentally they're doing that work because at the bottom of them is something about knowledge. So I think I mean in general, in philosophy, as in science and mathematics, beauty and elegance are quite good guides to the truth. And so when I see some kind of messy, inelegant definition, I'm pretty sure that it's not going to work. I mean, of course, you still have to do the hard work of finding out where it goes wrong, and maybe, you know, but I usually when I look at it, I can tell that there's going to be a counterexample, although you know, take a bit of a while to think out what the counterexample will be.
And for you, knowledge is the most general mental factive attitude. This is a non-reductive definition of knowledge. This is not a conceptual analysis. Nevertheless, this is a definition of knowledge, the most general mental factive attitude.
Yes, and so factive there is a technical term, and it means, you know, an attitude that you can only have to things that are true. So, for example, you know, if you see that that there's you know, a bird sitting on a stone, then it follows that there is a bird sitting on the stone. Otherwise, it's not seeing that something is the case. It's some kind of illusion. And if you remember that there was a bird sitting on a stone, then that is also factive because that could only be if there really was a bird sitting on a stone, and so on. And so these kind of factive, more specific factive attitudes are just all a specific forms of knowledge, and knowledge, as it were, knowledge is the one that includes all of these, in the same kind of way that the general property of being colored includes all the specific colors. So yeah, so I think that's the relation between knowledge and these more specific factive attitudes.
Maybe there is a connection between your definition of knowledge and Pritchard's epistemological disjunctivism, no?
Well, yes. I mean, of course. I mean, I think the forms of disjunctivism that I'm probably closer to are those of the kind of Oxford tradition of disjunctivism about perception, which goes back to people like Paul Snowden and John McDowell and Mike Martin would be a contemporary expert, and I do think that that their approach is quite similar to a knowledge first approach, and I mean in particular because they put an emphasis on the fundamentality of the good case of perception, where you really do see that something is the case. I mean, I wouldn't describe myself as a disjunctivist, because I think that way of putting things, although it's very common, it kind of, for sort of logical reasons, it actually conceals the fact that an important part of this approach is to understand the bad case, kind of a defective version of the good case, so that the good case and the bad case, they're not, as it were, mutually independent things which you then disjoin to get the general idea of appearance. There's just the bad case are the cases which are in some way similar to the good case, but defective from it. So that's a tradition of thinking about perception that in Oxford that probably goes back a very long way that I'm quite close to. I'm less sympathetic to the version of it that you find in Pritchard, which I think doesn't give as clear a picture as those people are.
Okay, Professor Williamson, solved or maybe dissolved the so-called Gettier problem, the famous Gettier problem.
Yes. So the Gettier problem, of course, is the problem of analyzing knowledge in terms of belief and truth and other factors. And it's named after Edmund Gettier, who in 1963, he famously gave counterexamples to the justified true belief analysis of knowledge, which was the sort of predominant one, at least in the sort of decades before he was writing. So I wouldn't say that I've solved that problem, but rather what I've done is to reject the problem as ill-posed, because we should not be trying to analyze knowledge in terms of belief. And so in a way, I think that problem has no solution. But what I've tried to do is to explain how to understand things, so it's not at all surprising that it has no solution.
But you dissolved the problem.
If you like, yes, yes.
Have you solved the skeptical problem about the external world, or maybe also dissolved it?
Well, so some people think of the skeptical problem about the external world as the problem of somehow convincing the skeptic that there is an external world, but starting only from assumptions and forms of argument that the skeptic themselves will accept. And I think that it's really clear that problem also can't be solved, because skeptics have taken trouble to accept so little that you cannot persuade them that there is an external world from their starting point, because their starting point is so impoverished. And I mean, the way I think of it is that once you fall into the pit of skepticism, there's no way of climbing out again by argument, starting from where you are, and so we just have to be careful not to fall into that pit ourselves. But I think what one can do is to examine skeptical arguments, which are in effect, as it were, arguments for jumping into the pit of skepticism, and we could show that that those are actually very bad arguments, that they make unreasonable assumptions in epistemology about knowledge and evidence and rationality and so on. And in fact, my experience is that some of the most dogmatic people one can encounter in philosophical debate are skeptics. I mean, they make a big show of how open-minded they are in a very self-righteous way, but it's absolutely clear that they're completely closed to any view but skepticism. Yeah, so I mean, I think one can do some things like that, but I think, as it were, the skeptical problem as it's sometimes posed is is simply insoluble, and that's really the skeptic's problem, not our problem.
Thank you. Professor Williamson, sometimes we know that we know something in ordinary life as well as in science if we use an established theory. For instance, we know a lot about things around us. We know that we know about them. We know that electrons exist and so on. So you argue that in general, the principle according to which whenever you know something, you know that you know it is false. How often is it violated?
Well, I think it's violated quite a lot. So let's just take any piece of knowledge. So, for example, right now I know that I'm talking, and I know that I'm talking.
You know that you know that you're talking.
Maybe I even know that I know that I know that I'm talking. But obviously, if we added more iterations of I know that, it would not be long before that we got to a statement that wasn't true. And I think that with pretty much any example of knowledge, if you keep iterating I know that, you'll get to something eventually which is, and maybe actually quite quickly, which is in fact false. So in a sense, it's the principle is violated almost everywhere in our knowledge, but as we're not always immediately. Sometimes you have to put in some iterations of I know that in order to get to the point of violation.
Okay, thank you. So in epistemology, there is a discussion about the fundamental epistemic good, the most valuable epistemic good. For example, I quote Pritchard again. So for him, this is truth. I think that this is knowledge. What do you think about it? What is the most fundamental epistemic good?
Yeah. So
and why?
Yes. So I think of I certainly think of the fundamental epistemic good as knowledge. And in fact, when people say that truth is an epistemic good, I mean, they mean that it's good to have truth, but actually the natural way of understanding what it is to have a truth is by knowing it. I mean, in some sense, if if you don't know the truth, you don't properly possess it. Now, of course, it is the case that that some epistemologists think that a true belief is the primary good, and of course, every time you know something, you also have a true belief in it, although not the other way, not conversely. So I think that, I mean, I find this a very odd idea that true belief is what really matters. I mean, the thing about belief that falls short of knowledge is that it's defective belief. And so mere true beliefs, which are not knowledge, there's something like fake knowledge. And of course, the believer doesn't realize that they're fake, but they are in fact fake knowledge. And and it seems like a strange idea that fake knowledge is the primary epistemic good. I mean, you could compare it with the case of hallucinations, so that, I mean, sometimes just by chance you might have a hallucination which matched the external reality just by accident, but it would still be a hallucination. And and I think that as well the natural goal is to really be, as it were, in touch with external reality, not simply to have a lucky hallucination. So I regard the idea of true belief as an epistemic good, as a kind of somewhat weird sort of deviation from the natural answer, which is simply knowledge. And I mean, I think it's a kind of focusing on true belief is something which may seem natural from the standpoint of belief first epistemology, but I think it really once one has one's epistemology properly sorted out, it really is not an attractive ideal at all.
Okay, thank you. Professor Williamson, why do you think that knowing how is a kind of knowing that?
Okay, so so I should explain that there was a long tradition of saying that knowing how to do things is a completely different kind of knowledge from knowing that something is the case, that it's non-propositional. And I mean, this is a sort of view that was associated, for example, with actually the Oxford philosopher Gilbert Ryle, but I mean, it was very standard. And then Jason Stanley, a philosopher at Yale, and I, in 2001, we published this very controversial paper where we argued that knowing how is just a special case of knowing that. So just to explain the kind of thing that I have in mind. So for example, I know how to pronounce the name Leicester, and that knowledge consists in that I know that the following is a way to pronounce it, Leicester. And when I say that, when I said the following, I was kind of pointing to as a way of pronouncing it that, as understood from the inside, as something that something understood from the perspective of the doer rather than the perspective of a passive hearer or other observer. And that sort of formula, that knowing how to do something is knowing concerning some way understood in this practical way, that's a way to do it, works quite generally. So the arguments for that really have to do with the nature of indirect questions, because when we talk about knowing how to do something, the how there is forming an indirect question, and what we're doing is we're just applying some very general principles about how indirect questions work, like with why, when, where, what, which, who, whether, and so on, to this case. And we're also, these are also patterns which don't just apply to the verb know, they apply to lots of other cognitive verbs like learn, remember, forget, see, and so on. And so once you've seen these very general patterns, all of which involve these kind of knowing who or knowing whether, or these are all forms of propositional knowledge. They're all forms of knowing that, and knowing how to do something just falls perfectly into that pattern. And so it would be very, very strange if it were an exception, or if there were anything very special about it. I mean, I sometimes think that it's a pity that the word how is spelt H-O-W. If it was spelt W-H-O-W, it was another W-H word, I think people would have seen the pattern a bit more easily. But I mean, it's a complicated issue because, of course, the arguments that we were using, I mean, they were primarily applied to English, and it's true that the pattern isn't exactly the same in other languages. It's not exactly the same in Russian, for example. But I think one of the complications that's going on there, and that has kind of somewhat obscured the issue is that that often there are many different ways of describing some state of affairs which are not logically equivalent to each other, but for practical purposes are more or less the same. So, for example, I mean, in English, you can say that somebody knows how to swim, but you can also say that they can swim. And saying that somebody can swim and saying that they know how to swim, they're not totally equivalent, but for most purposes, it doesn't really matter which you say. And so when you say that somebody knows how to swim, it is a logical consequence of that they have some propositional knowledge. Whereas if you just say that they can swim, that does not logically entail that they have knowledge. But of course, as a matter of fact, we know that people who can swim do know how to swim and so on. And so I think sometimes people focus on these other ways of ascribing abilities and think that they have to be equivalent to knowing how to swim, but they're not really equivalent. I mean, an example where they come apart is that people can digest their food, but they don't know how to digest their food. They just do it. But of course, with something like swimming, at least for human beings, we can only do it if we know how to do it. So I think that those kind of subtle logical differences between expressions which are for practical purposes often more or less equally good have sort of obscured the picture, and so it's still a very controversial issue. But I think the arguments that we gave have basically stood up to scrutiny pretty well.
And what about skill? Is possessing skill is a necessary and sufficient condition for having knowledge? How?
I think, well, skill, on the view that Jason Stanley and I developed, it really consists in having the knowledge that you need to control your actions of the relevant kind, and that's a big difference between skill and strength. I mean, skill involves knowledge, but strength doesn't involve. It doesn't consist in knowledge. And I think it's true that skill typically involves a lot of knowledge how to do things, but you can have some basic know-how without having the skill. For example, I mean, I know how to play football, but no one would describe me as having skill at football.
You have basic skill. You have basic skill in how.
Well, I mean, if you're willing to kind of water down the word skill enough, you could say that as it were, that just knowing how to play football, that's some kind of sort of minimal skill. So if one extends the word skill enough, then there might be equivalent. But
so for you, all knowledge is propositional, maybe even by definition, no?
So of course, we also. So I mean, so know-how and those kind of constructions are propositional. But I mean, we also talk about things like, knowing a person or knowing a place. And I think fundamentally that is that is propositional knowledge, but of course one needs more. One needs to argue that. But for example, often when we talk about whether we know a person, we're thinking about whether we've met them and so on. But I think it's true that that you do have to retain some knowledge about them in order to count as knowing them. I mean, I think we say that someone with very severe Alzheimer's no longer knows members of their own family or something like that. And I think that the kind of, that does involve a loss of propositional knowledge. For example, that somebody with Alzheimer's, in the presence of their son, they might not know that he is their son, and so that's a piece of propositional knowledge that they're lacking.
Okay, thank you, Professor Williamson. And what do you think about the hybrid series? For example, knowledge first reliabilism, knowledge first virtue epistemology, and so on. They combine your knowledge first epistemology with more traditional theories.
Yes.
In my view, they mix incompatible theories. In my view, something like that happened at the beginning of the 20th century with the old quantum mechanics. Mixed the classical language and the new quantum language. So, what do you think about this combination?
I think I agree. I'm not convinced that these theories really answer any genuine explanatory need. And I think sometimes people treat constructing philosophical theories like mixing cocktails, that they take some Goldman or Sousa and then add a few drops of Williamson and stir them all together. But that's not a good way to produce a theory. And I think if you've got two theories, neither of which works by itself, if you try to put them together, you're very unlikely to get a working theory.
Okay, thank you. That's true, yeah. And in contemporary epistemology, there are different versions of epistemic contextualism and epistemic relativism. Do you think that some of them are plausible, at least in some limited domain of application? And if so, which of them?
Well, so there are certainly some forms of contextualism about some epistemic phrases which seem correct. So for example, if we talk about knowing who someone is, that seems to depend on context, because sometimes it's a matter of putting a name to a face, but sometimes it's a matter of putting a face to a name, and so on. But in that case, although I think there is context dependence, it probably in fact comes not from the know part, but from the who part. That the who, because we're talking about, because the question who's that can actually mean different things depending on the context in which it's uttered, because the meaning of a question depends on the possible answers. And I think in different contexts, one has different sets of possible answers that are relevant. And so I'm not convinced of the case for epistemic contextualism about sort of fundamental epistemic terms like know. So, I mean, it is true that that we sometimes give answers to epistemic questions that depend on the context. So for example, when you're asked, do you know such and such, you might answer yes if you're in a bar with very low standards, but answer no if you're in a courtroom where the standards are very high. But I mean, examples like that don't really show that there's a difference in meaning as opposed to in simply the standards that we're using. And so an analogy would be, if you have a football fan, if he's in a bar with other supporters of the same team, and he may say sort of optimistically that their team will win tomorrow's match, whereas if he's talking to someone that he wants to impress long term with his powers of prediction, he might more realistically say that the other side will win. But I mean, that's not a case of contextualism. I mean, it isn't that the word win means something different in those two contexts. It's just that that what people say depends on their social context to some extent, and so I'm not really convinced that what's going on in the case, in the examples which people have tried to use to motivate epistemic contextualism, that they really show anything of that kind.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, by the way, were you asking about epistemic relativism as well? Or yes,
yeah.
okay. So I should say I'm even more skeptical about epistemic relativism, because I don't really think that there are any robust data that it's needed to explain, and I'm very skeptical about relativist accounts in general, because they involve making sort of radical changes to the semantic framework of phenomena like personal taste. I think often what's going on with these accounts is that, as it were, people are trying to outsource their own relativist theories to the natural language, and as far as I can see, when you really describe the data, even about matters like personal taste, carefully, with no antecedent bias towards relativism, they can always be described in non-relativist terms more economically and more illuminatingly.
Okay, thank you. So, if I'm not mistaken, you think that a priori, a posteriori distinction is not significant. Why do you think so? Is it useful nevertheless?
Well, so I think it's not a complete illusion, and so I think it might be useful, as it were, at a relatively naive level. So for example, in some kind of very loose way, we could, if we were explaining what this distinction was to someone, we could say, well, mathematical knowledge is a priori and geographical knowledge is a posteriori, and and that one depends on experience and the other doesn't, and that, I mean, that wouldn't be completely wrong, but it's kind of a bit sort of superficial. I mean, in the way that if we were talking to children, we might try to classify flowers as yellow or red or whatever by color, but of course that's not a deep distinction between them. It's picking up a difference between them that's kind of genuine but superficial. So I think the cases that I concentrate on to try to show that this distinction doesn't go very deep, they really have to do with the role of the imagination in gaining knowledge, because the imagination is not simply a role. It's not simply a faculty, of fiction and so on. It actually plays a serious role in enabling us to know about various things, and so it could even play a role when we're assessing sort of generalizations, where we can't actually survey all the members of the domain. So for example, if you said something like curly-haired children are not straight-haired or something like that, of course that's easy to know, and roughly speaking, probably the way we do it is we imagine a curly-haired child, and then we kind of judge just in the imagination whether they're straight-haired, and the answer is no. And then, for example, supposing we had to judge the generalization that life size gold statues of national presidents are kitsch luxury items or something like that, we would imagine such a statue and make a judgment about it. So often, what we're doing is when we're judging whether F's are G's, whatever F and G are, but we kind of imagine an F, and then we make a judgment about whether it's a G or not. And if that's done in a controlled way, it can actually lead to knowledge. And the thing is, that process, it's not using experience directly, because we're doing it in the imagination, so we're not doing it by sense perception. But it's drawing on our ability to classify things, which is something that was typically developed in experience, but we're not using it in experience. And so in some of the cases, the judgments, I mean, the knowledge that we acquire through the imagination, we count it as a priori. If you something like, a curly-haired child is not a straight-haired child, that would be, I guess, would be counted as a priori. But whereas some of the other examples would be classified as a posteriori. But the actual cognitive process is working in the same way. I mean, we're using our capacity to assess, to recognize whether something's an F, and our capacity to recognize whether it's a G, so that, as it were, experience is kind of in there in the background, because it's given, because we've developed our recognitional capacities through experience, but it's not being directly used here. And so I think once one's seen that it's fundamentally that kind of process that's often being used, and sometimes the result is classified as a priori and sometimes as a posteriori, but it's fundamentally the same process. What that suggests is that it's not really a deep distinction, because there's so little difference between ones which seem clearly on the a priori side and ones which seem clearly on the a posteriori side. So as where I think it's, if one were teaching some 18-year-olds very basic epistemology, I think it would be okay to teach them, the a priori, a posteriori distinction. I don't think it would do any harm, but I think once one tries to treat it as something really deep and fundamental, when one's going wrong.
Distinction between the analytical and synthetic also.
So, of course, that has been made in various ways, but I mean, fundamentally, I don't really think that there are analytic truths. So even truths of logic, for example, I wouldn't regard as analytic, because, well, as I said, people make the distinction in different ways, but in all these cases, these truths, I mean, for example, and like everything is self-identical, with as a logical truth. I mean, that's true because everything is self-identical. So that as well, we can't just leave out the reference to the world. And people sometimes try to claim that, well, they define a notion of analyticity as something that where if you understand the sentence at all, then you will assent to it. But what I've argued is that really for any sentence whatsoever, including something like everything is self-identical, it's possible to have some kind of deviant theorist who does understand it by normal linguistic standards, and yet, in some kind of ingeniously wrong-headed way, they reject it. And that's not because of lack of linguistic competence or something like that. It's simply because what you accept or reject is partly a matter of your theoretical commitments.
Okay, thank you. And what is your position about the nature of consciousness? So I mean, for example, how do you understand the so-called explanatory gap problem or hard problem in philosophy of mind? All this discussion, and what would you say about the nature of consciousness? Yeah.
Well, I think consciousness is real. I mean, after all, when we're awake, we really are conscious, and we're conscious of various things in the world. I mean, there are surely several different kinds of consciousness. So so there is something there to be understood, but I find a lot of the philosophical discussion of it rather annoying. I mean, in the 1970s, Thomas Nagel published a famous article called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" Which sort of made the discussion center on the phrase what it's like as a kind of index of consciousness, and that, as it were, it's conscious because it's something that it's like to be a bat. And I think at the time that was a very valuable article, because it was a time when behaviorist psychology was still very influential, at least in philosophy of mind, and was doing a lot of damage. And I don't think, as it were, it was one of the articles which helped people sort of get over their behaviorist inhibitions and and accept that there really is something here to be understood. But I think that phrase, what it's like, it's now well past its sell-by date, and yet people treat it as a kind of magical wand that you just say, well, consciousness is what it's like, and I don't think that it really explains anything very much at all. I think they maybe have the idea that it just tells you to look inwards, and then you'll somehow be acquainted with the inner nature of consciousness. But I think that's just, as it were, introspection really doesn't tell one very much about the nature of consciousness. So I think that part of the problem is that we haven't really established a very perspicuous idiom for describing consciousness and so it's much less clear what the data are that need to be explained than people think. And and some people still talk about qualia and which I find sort of totally unhelpful. It seems to me it's a kind of way of thinking about the mind that was state of the art in about 1740 or something like that, but it's really we should be able to do better than that by now. And so so if people are just using phrases like the explanatory gap problem and the hard problem as kind of labels for this general area of confusion where we don't really know what the best way of thinking about these things, and that's okay. But I think people often assume that there's a much more sharply defined issue there than there really is. I mean, what I expect is that gradually, through some combination of advances in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy, I don't think it can be done without philosophy, that we will gradually have more and more nuanced and informative accounts of consciousness, of the relevant psychological phenomena in this area, and maybe, as it were, we'll replace one general area of philosophical confusion with uncertainty about much more specific issues. I mean, there are probably issues about exactly how explanations at different levels map onto each other. Will, I mean, then they may well stay with us. But I think the idea that, as it were, there's a very precise and terribly difficult problem that we have put our finger on, but we just don't know the answer to it. Or I don't think that's the situation. I think it's as it were, there's much more general confusion, and as it were, the people who are most confident that they know exactly what they're talking about when they talk about consciousness are probably the ones who are the most confused of all.
Thank you. So, Professor Williamson, do you believe in God? Or maybe you think that the religious beliefs are false? Or maybe there is a religious form of life practice in which the religious beliefs play the role of the Wittgensteinian hinge propositions. What do you think about all this?
So I'm an atheist. I think that there are no gods or angels or devils or hobgoblins in any non-cheating sense of the terms, and so I think that many religious beliefs are just false, and I don't think of the kind of Wittgensteinian language games approach to religion as really giving most religious people what they want. I think it's, as it were, that kind of treatment of religion is really for maybe Western intellectuals who are basically atheists but don't like to admit it, and as it were, so they can continue with some religious practices without any real religious beliefs. So, I mean, of course, people vary. So I once had a colleague who was, I mean, I was in a philosophy department, and the theology department was next door, and a young theologian who'd been educated by Hans Kung and others, and I remember trying to. He's notionally a Roman Catholic, but I was asking him, so what actually do you need to believe in order to be a Christian? And he didn't really want to give any kind of proposition that you needed to believe in order to be a Christian. And then, but I pressed him, and finally he gave the proposition that the cross is a powerful symbol, which I think, I mean, I think I believe that the cross is a powerful symbol, but that kind of very minimal attitude to religion, as I say, I think the great majority of religious people would not be satisfied with that kind of, as it were, performative attitude. And so, of course, I think, I mean, for sure, many people find religion comforting, but that doesn't make it true. And it seems to me that the challenge is to find a way to live without self-deception and wishful thinking. And I sometimes enjoy the Voltaire saying that the progress of a river to the sea is not more swift than that of mankind to error.
Thank you. And what do you think at present are the most important problems in philosophy? The most important problems in contemporary philosophy? What do you think about?
Well, so of course, like any other science, I mean, philosophy is full of unsolved problems, and solving one of them, one problem raises lots of new ones. So, I mean, ignorance is a sort of many-headed hydra. So, I think many philosophical problems, including contemporary philosophical problems, have to do with the relation between a sort of common sense view of the world and scientific discoveries. That, as well, to work out what kind of impact the discoveries of the natural sciences should have on our common sense view. And these are not problems that can be left to the scientists themselves, because although they understand the science very well, but they're not trained in the kind of reasoning that is needed to make connections between the science and the common sense ideas. So, for example, often neuroscientists will say things like neuroscience has shown that free will is an illusion, but it's clear from the way they're talking that they have an extremely naive and simplistic conception of what free will is supposed to be. And so for example, in the area of epistemology, I'm pretty confident that something that's going to be important in epistemology as we go forward is taking account of advances in psychology. But I mean, I don't think we can hand over epistemology to psychologists. That's
formal methods, mathematical methods, and epistemology.
Well, yes. Well, so I think that formal methods. I mean, there's been a lot of development in informal methods in epistemology, and it's difficult to get a good balance between the formal methods and the epistemology, because or in other branches of philosophy, because you get people who are, on the one hand, you get the people who are very good at the formal methods but naive about the philosophy, and then vice versa, and somehow we need to combine those things, and so I think wherever you have areas of philosophy where mathematical methods are being used, then you have lots of problems associated with that. But they're not, as it were, it's not that there's one huge problem that's unsolved. I mean, unless you treat it as the problem is, what is human knowledge, or some kind of, as a generic term there. But I think that, as it were, in practice, in order to make progress, we do have to look at more specific questions where it is possible to make more progress. I mean, of course, I think some people would say that that when you think about the kind of environmental crisis that humanity faces, and all the brutal and bigoted regimes in many parts of the world that people live under, and all the triumphs of ignorance and stupidity, that some philosophers are thinking, well, maybe they should, as it were, have a more practical role, and maybe a more politically engaged role, that, as it were, that they think that philosophers should be activists, but I think there is room for such philosophy and value in it, but I think if that led to the decline of very theoretical philosophy, which it could, that would basically be another victory for the enemies of reason, and so sometimes I compare our situation to that of the 1930s, when there were some terrifying totalitarian regimes, and war was threatening, and so on. But then, if you think, I mean, there were, so of course, I'm doing nothing to diminish how urgent and serious those problems were, but it was also the case that at that time there were two of the greatest logicians who ever lived, Kurt Gödel and Alfred Tarski, and of course they could have spent their time in campaigning politically against the rise of Nazism or something, but which certainly was one of the most evil political movements. But actually what they did was they got on with their research and logic and contributed far more probably to civilization by doing research and logic than they would have contributed as political activists.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, that's not to say that I'm not talking down political activism. I'm just saying that you know, as philosophers, we have a job to do in carrying forward the philosophical tradition, and we mustn't forget that that's part of what we're doing, even in the most adverse circumstances.
So what do you think about the future developments of philosophy? What?
So, I mean, it's hard for me to say. I mean, but I mean, I think, well, there's a few things one can say. I mean, one is that it's clear that that globalization is having an effect in philosophy, as of course it is in all academic disciplines, and so as we're thinking in particular of analytic philosophy, I mean, broadly understood, not as conceptual analysis, because that's something that people really don't really do, but just as it were a way of doing philosophy, which is at least to some extent scientific in spirit or something like that. I mean, that's something that has been spreading around the globe in recent decades. I mean, there was a period when it was confined to, I mean, long ago, perhaps just after the Second World War, where it was mainly confined to English-speaking countries, you know, with maybe Scandinavia or something in it. But whereas now there seem to be analytic philosophers in almost every country in the world, and even the pandemic has been contributing to that, because you know, it's easier to, I mean, as well, there's more appetite for virtual lectures. You know, so I find myself lecturing to an audience of several thousand virtual in China, and so I think that's certainly something that's going to, I mean, the globalization will continue. You know, if one looks within you know, what's going on in analytic philosophy, I mean, you know, one of the most striking things is the growth of speculative metaphysics, because you know, analytic philosophy, which, you know, came out of a combination of logical positivism and a kind of ordinary language approach, both of which were somewhat anti-metaphysical, well, very anti-metaphysical in the case of logical positivism, and somewhat in the case of the ordinary language philosophy. I mean, it's now the home of, you know, of kinds of metaphysics that you know, might have quite, in some ways, quite familiar to Leibniz or someone, and so that's that's I think a way in which analytic philosophy has kind of opened up, and where the term analytic just has to be applied very loosely, but. So, you know, I think, you know, it's hard to make predictions, as, you know, people sometimes say. If I knew where philosophy was going, I'd be there already.
Yeah, yes, that's true. Yeah, thank you. You said that analytic philosophy is everywhere now, but some continental philosophers say that analytic philosophy is in crisis now. So, is it true? Is current in crisis?
I think, I mean, people have been saying that analytic philosophy was in crisis ever since the phrase analytic philosophy, entered the language. And the people who say that are often people who know virtually nothing about analytic philosophy. So that I think often it's just wishful thinking. I mean, of course, I think you can find people within analytic philosophy who think that it's somehow not going well. And I mean, in my view, there's just a kind of impatience about that really what they're reacting to is the fact that a lot of it is what in Kuhnian terms you might call normal science, and so as it were, people are just soberly getting on with worthwhile investigations, but not investigations which are going to revolutionize the whole field. But I think the idea that one should be constantly looking for revolutions is, in philosophy, we can't have a perpetual revolution because we never get anywhere. And so I think that there's also, as it were, there's maybe a bit of a tendency amongst philosophers to self-flagellation, which and to constant criticism of their own tradition, which I think is often, often there's something to their criticisms, but I think often too that as it were, they get things out of perspective, and I think something that philosophers are prone to is comparing a somewhat pessimistic view of philosophy with highly idealized views of other academic disciplines, and my experience is that sometimes I've wanted to go to neighboring scientific disciplines just to get the answer to some question that seemed philosophically relevant, but my general experience has been that whenever I looked at what was going on in some relevant bit of another discipline, I'd find that there was much more disarray and disagreement and so on there, and it was more like philosophy than as where philosophers tend to imagine.
But do you think that the gap between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy is narrowing?
Well, it's not, of course, it's not so easy to say just what counts as each, but I think it's true that, of course, the term continental philosophy was always used for a huge mixture of different traditions, which were really only held together by the fact that they were not analytic philosophy, and maybe that perhaps as well that they didn't have much acquaintance with modern logic. And I think it's probably true that analytic philosophy itself has become a much more diverse tradition than it was, and I think that's broadly a good thing. I think often, when we're classifying, which tradition do people belong to, a lot of it has to do with, who are the influences on them, who are they reading and engaging with, and my impression is that as it were, there are still traditions which could crudely be classified as continental philosophy, where people are not engaging with, as it were, anything that would normally be described as analytic philosophy at all. And and vice versa, that as where people in analytic philosophy are not engaging with anything in those traditions. And I think where you have that, it's very difficult for fruitful interaction to take place, because there isn't a common language that people can use. And so in those respects, I'm not sure that things have changed so much. I think that so for example, Hegel used to be classified as an extreme continental philosopher, and no analytic philosopher would want to touch Hegel. And of course now you have people like Brandom who are who certainly count as analytic philosophers, but who are interested in Hegel, and so, as it were, Hegel has to some extent is now studied within the analytic tradition, and I think that kind of broadening is good, but it doesn't really mean a breaking down of the barriers, because there's still there are other people studying Hegel in a completely different way, who've maybe never even heard of Brandom or whatever, and so that you still, even on a single author like that, you may still have traditions that scarcely interact with each other at all. So I think there are those kind of the barrier is perhaps the wrong word, because there's nothing institutionally to prevent people engaging, but there are these forms of non-communication that I think may be, as it were, similar to the ones that were around when I was a student. But
by the way, what do you think about Brandom's analytic interpretation of Hegel? Briefly, if you.
Yeah. So I'm not a specialist here, and my vague impression is that it might have more to do with Brandom than it has to do with Hegel, but I'm not saying that with any real authority, so I don't want to.
Okay, sure. You spoke about metaphysics. This is a tendency in analytic philosophy, speculative metaphysics. I think you are a metaphysician, of course, but I don't think that you are a speculative metaphysician. So do you accept the pre-Kantian metaphysics or something like that?
Well, so it's true that most of the work that I've done in metaphysics has been very closely related to logic, and so, as it were, it's quite a certain kind of intellectual discipline.
From logic as metaphysics,
yes.
Good as evil.
But the thing, I don't regard the phrase pre-Kantian metaphysics as negative. So, if you think about the kind of metaphysics that was done by people like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz and so on, I mean, they were people who were sure that they were producing speculative theories, but they were producing them partly in the light of what was then contemporary science, and particularly in the case of Descartes and Leibniz, they were major contributors to it. So that it was not, as it was, some kind of pathological phenomenon at all. I mean, they may have been asking questions that it was beyond the capacity of the intellectual community at the time to answer, but so were the ancient Greeks. I don't think that that's such a bad thing to be happening, and I guess the perception amongst many analytic philosophers was that, and particularly metaphysicians, was that really Kant did not somehow reveal some essential limitation of metaphysics. You know, that did not reveal bounds of sense which we have to be careful not to transgress or whatever. So you know, I think speculative metaphysics, in the sense of putting forward theories for which, you know, we don't have a great deal of evidence, but nevertheless which have a lot of interesting consequences. I don't regard that as you know, as at all a discreditable enterprise, provided that people are clear about what they're doing and don't pretend that these theories are better supported by the evidence than they really are. I mean, you know, I suppose the kind of worry that one might have is that that these theories, as where it's not always it's all clear what exactly the consequences of these theories are. So maybe that, you know, but because they're not formulated clearly enough, you know, for one to know what they imply. And but that's not a problem about being too bold. It's a problem about not being bold enough, about not taking the kind of intellectual risks that are taken when one does formulate theories from which it's relatively easy to deduce all sorts of consequences. And you know, I think one might feel that also that it would be better if there were a bit more connection between contemporary metaphysics and contemporary science. That you know, because I think often one has the feeling that the metaphysicians are. It's not that they think that science is irrelevant, but just that they have a rather old-fashioned and uninformed picture of what's going on in the science, and that it would be better if they were more in touch with scientific developments. But of course, it's very difficult, and even harder now than it was in the 17th century to really be on top of what's happening in metaphysics and on top of what's happening in fundamental physics as well. But
there is progress in science, there is progress in philosophy for you, I think so, and there is progress in metaphysics.
There's some progress in metaphysics, but I think
progress in philosophy, of course, yeah, for you.
Yes. I do think we have to be, there's progress, but it's not automatic, and I do think we have to be very careful about our methodology. That, you know, if we're not careful, we can slip into ways of doing philosophy where no real progress is made. But as it were, if we do things properly, we can make some progress. Yes.
And do you have any idea about Quentin Meillassoux' speculative materialism, French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux?
So I haven't read his work. I haven't read anything about him that made me want to read his work, but maybe I'm missing something.
Okay, thank you. Because we spoke about metaphysics and speculative metaphysics. So, Professor Williamson, how to write a good philosophical article?
So I think, well, one thing I would say is that one shouldn't be too concerned about saying something new for the sake of it. I think that it's much better to be concerned with saying something true, and then if one's, you know, when one's really careful about that, really makes an effort to get clear about what's true and what's false in some area, that often forces you to say something new, because you realize that what's been said before is inadequate. But as I say, I don't think one should be trying to say something new, and I also don't think one should be trying to say something deep. I think it's just enough to try to be true, and then if you're working with an interesting problem, often you may be forced to say something deeper, but it shouldn't be. I think if people just try to say something deep, they're likely to end up being sort of pretentious. But I think one thing is that, of course, different people work in different ways, but I think for many philosophers, the process of writing and the process of thinking are completely intertwined. So that it's only when you sit down and try to write something that your ideas become properly clear. And I think if people sometimes think that, oh well, these ideas are clear in my head, but I just don't know how to put them down on paper, that's usually an illusion. I mean, philosophy is something which is at least 99% of the time is done in words, and so and until you have the words, you don't really have a piece of philosophy there, and so I think that that it's finding a productive and efficient way of writing that is often the key to developing the philosophical ideas as well.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But before writing, you have to think a lot about your ideas, or you are just writing and then your ideas come.
Well, of course, you can't just start writing from nothing, so I think a kind of common experience is that one's involved in philosophical discussion, and as through talking to people, some kind of vague idea emerges, and then you see some way of developing it in discussion with others, or sometimes it's reading other philosophers that you read something and you see that there's something wrong with it in an interesting way, and you really want to explain what it is that's going wrong there. So I think what certainly does not work is the picture of the philosopher as a kind of isolated guru who just sits on top of a mountain and as it were works out their ideas in isolation. That I think you have to be, as it were, part of a community, where people are asking you difficult questions and so on, to really to be forced to work, to the kind of standards that the community requires. And I think it's just and also to know who you're trying to persuade with your arguments, because if you don't have any readers in mind that you're trying to engage with, the question of how you argue doesn't really make very much sense, because if the only person you have to satisfy is yourself. So I think it's it's important to be part of a philosophical community, but of course that doesn't mean that that the process of writing itself has to be in communication with other people. I mean, as we're out of one discussion with other people, I might take enough from that I can then sit down and write an article. But I think also, I mean, these days most philosophers are showing, I mean, sending other people their papers and getting comments and so on, so that even though it's still the case that most philosophical articles and books have a single author, they're in fact to some extent a product of collaborative effort.
Okay, thank you. Anyway, Professor Williamson, do you have your own method to work?
Well, I mean, so what I've been describing is a bit what I do. I mean, I think one thing that perhaps helps me is that I have some, as it were, some very definite red lines that I won't cross. So as well, whatever I do will be done strictly within classical logic and within a realist approach, and so as it were, the whole lot of ideas that other people might be tempted by, that for me are just they just feel wrong. So as it were, that helps to give me a kind of sense of intellectual direction that as it were makes it easier for me to know where I'm going, and I have certain other guidelines. So, for example, in epistemology, I think it's important that non-human animals have knowledge, and so any kind of epistemology that doesn't really make much sense for non-human animals, I'm already pretty suspicious of.
Do you work how many hours per day?
I don't really keep count, but of course under lockdown, working at home, it's harder to know. But so before the pandemic, I would do most of my work in my room in New College, and I think so I would start work at 8:30 in the morning and finish work at 6:30 in the evening. So I mean, I've heard people tell me that there are sort of rumors that I work 16 hours a day or 20 hours a day or something like that, but that's nonsense. I just work, a reasonable number of hours.
Of course, you do also other things, not only to work. So, Professor Williamson, what are your philosophical projects?
Oh, well, there are various things that I'm interested in at the moment. So, so one analogy that's already present in knowledge and its limits is between knowledge and action. And a few years ago, I rethought that, and so I'm interested in various connections between knowledge and action, and increasingly I'm interested in issues about how knowledge of the good guides action. The good there, not in a specifically moral sense, but as we're a somewhat more general sense too. And I think that if if one thinks about, for example, about how the phenomenon of desire might have evolved. I mean, you realize that from an evolutionary point of view, it's important not just to have desires, but to desire the right kind of things. And so I'm inclined to think that that, as it were, desires, non-defective desires are in effect something like knowledge of the good, and so I want to explore that idea, and so that's one strand, and another strand, which in fact has some subterranean connections with that, but they're not obvious, is that I'm interested in the issue about the relation. I mean, what one could broadly put by saying the relation between what we think and how we think it, which, so roughly speaking, between the content of thought and what one could call its form, for example, the linguistic form in which we put it. And although it might also, maybe when we can think imagistically, and then it would be something more like a visual, pictorial form. And I think, I mean, at the present, there's a kind of tendency to try to put all sorts of aspects of the form of thought into the content of thought. So these are what are sometimes known as hyperintentional views, and it seems to me that there are reasons for thinking that that we just can't avoid making this distinction between form and content in thought, and that we, as it were, really to understand what's going on cognitively, we just have to keep track of these two levels and not try to fuse them into a single level. And I think that all sorts of philosophical errors are actually the product of not making this distinction between form and content properly. And I think, for example, even the connection with what I was saying before is anti-realism about morality is maybe ultimately a product of failure to distinguish between form and content in the right way. So those are a couple of things that I'm working on at the moment.
Very interesting, yeah. Professor Williamson, thank you very much for this interview. It was my pleasure to discuss with you. All the best for you and for your research.
Well, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure for me too. So,
goodbye.
Goodbye.